I awakened a system that let me steal everyone's bloodline. The first thing Kael Vorrin noticed was that the sky had no color. It was not black, nor gray, nor any hue he could name. It was simply wrong. It cracked in places like glass, revealing flashes of light beyond, blue fire flickering through unseen seams. Somewhere far below, metal shrieked. The second thing he noticed was that he was falling. The cabin lights pulsed red, the ceiling split wide open, and what was once an aircraft cabin was now little more than a metal tomb plummeting through the atmosphere. People had screamed, he remembered that, but the noise had become muffled like everything was underwater. His fingers dug into a cracked seat armrest. His body pressed hard against a twisted seatbelt strap. Then came the tearing sound, not of wind or steel but of something deeper. Like the world itself was being unzipped. System interruption detected. Error. Origin point misaligned. Sync loss, 92%. You are not supposed to be here. Initializing failstate parameters. Designation, null class observer. Beginning echo sequence. His eyes rolled back. And then, blackness. Kael woke to silence. His back ached. His mouth tasted of smoke and iron. He lay on coarse, cracked stone, charcoal black, warm to the touch. The air stank of burned plastic and ozone. He pushed himself up slowly, one arm trembling beneath him. The wreckage was everywhere. A wide crescent of twisted metal lay scattered across a vast, empty beach. The ocean was gone, replaced by a distant horizon of jagged rocks and flickering energy storms. Giant monoliths floated lazily above the skyline, like ruins torn from the sky and left to drift. He blinked, trying to focus. Where were the others? Where were the rescue crews? The helicopters? The noise? Nothing. Just wind. And the low hum of a world holding its breath. Kael took a shaky step forward. His legs screamed in protest. Blood soaked the side of his pants. A shallow gash maybe, but it hurt with every movement. He turned toward the largest chunk of the fuselage, hoping to find something, anyone. That's when it happened. The ringing started in his ears. Then came the light. It wasn't light in the normal sense. Not sunlight. Not electricity. This light came from nowhere, and yet it filled the space in front of him, shaping itself into lines, icons, and flickering glyphs. System log, corrupted. User detected, unknown signature. Initiating emergency protocol. Null access granted. Welcome observer. You should not exist. Kael stumbled backward. The interface followed him, like a screen etched into the air. Faint, translucent, buzzing like static in his mind. What the hell is this? No answer. Just more symbols. And then they vanished as quickly as they had appeared. He clutched his head. His pulse thundered in his ears. I'm dreaming. I hit my head. This is a hallucination. But somewhere deep inside he knew the truth. The system, whatever it was, had recognized him. And it wasn't happy. The silence didn't last. Kael heard it before he saw it. Metal scraping stone. A low, rhythmic breath that hissed like hydraulic pressure. He turned toward the sound, limbs stiff from adrenaline and pain. It crawled out from the wreckage. A dog-like shape. No fur. No eyes. Just steel-plated bones and pulsing red circuits exposed through torn armor. Relic-born hound, designation. Abandoned unit. Status, instinct protocol engaged. Target acquired, unknown echo signature. It charged. Kael ran. He didn't think. Instinct ruled. He vaulted over a piece of twisted wing, slammed into a burned-out seat, scrambled through open ground, barely avoiding the beast's snap. The creature was fast, far too fast for something made of metal and wires. His lungs burned. He spotted a narrow space between two slabs of collapsed fuselage. Dived in. The relic-born slammed into the metal beside him, denting the wall with terrifying force. He stayed low, shaking, every breath a knife in his chest. Then the thing stopped. It sniffed once. A spark of red blinked in the darkness. And then it turned and vanished back into the wreckage. What? Kael waited 5 full minutes before moving again. He found the survival pack near a half-melted escape door. Inside, dried food, water capsule, emergency glow light, and something else. A small metal disc with embedded sigils. As soon as he touched it, the interface returned. But this time it expanded. Status interface, prototype access. Name, Kael Vorrin. Class, null class observer. Level, undefined. Lineage, unregistered. Core statistics. Vitality, 3. Reflex, 5. Cognition, 8. Sync rate, 11%. Fragments, 0. Rune compatibility, error. System access, limited. You are not bound to a path. You are free. You are alone. You are wrong. Kael stared at the screen for a long time. A million questions circled in his mind. What was a lineage? What did it mean to be unbound? Why did the system speak like it was angry? He tucked the disc away, shivered, and moved on. As night fell, if this world even had night, Kael found a crumbling rock shelf near a shallow canyon. It shielded him from the wind. He wrapped his wounds as best he could, ate something dry and tasteless, drank half the water ration. Then he stared out across the dark world. The stars above flickered and blinked like dying lights. He thought of the plane, of the girl who'd been seated beside him. Had she screamed? Had she fallen through that hole in the ceiling when the sky tore open? He didn't remember. He remembered only the system, the voice, the designation. Null class observer. It wasn't a title. It was a curse. Kael rested with his back against the stone, fingers clenched around the hilt of a broken tool he'd fashioned into a crude blade. No heroics. No magic. Just survival. But even here, on the edge of some shattered world, he felt something deep inside. Not destiny. Not hope. Something stranger. Like the world itself, knew he was here. Like it had been waiting for him. And somewhere in the distance, beyond storms and static, the ground itself sang, a sound like memory. Kael closed his eyes. He whispered, I don't know what this place is, but it remembers me. Kael's dreams were fractured. He saw corridors of light, voices calling his name in a tongue he didn't recognize, cold stone beneath his feet and 1,000 dying stars above. When he woke, the world was silent, until it wasn't. The hound had returned. He didn't see it, but he felt it. A hum in the air like pressure dropping. The way static rises before lightning. He rolled to his side just in time to see it crouched atop the ridge above, its red optics blinking like coals. Not the same one. Another. Its breath steamed in the cold. And this time it didn't hesitate. It jumped. Kael rolled, barely avoiding the swipe of its claws. Pain tore through his side. His earlier wound reopened. He scrambled for his broken tool blade. The creature lunged. Kael didn't swing. He sidestepped, ducked under its momentum, and drove the jagged metal into a seam between its shoulder plates. Sparks flew. It screamed. But the fight wasn't over. The hound twisted, throwing Kael to the ground. Its forelimb crashed down, pinning his shoulder. Its head loomed above, teeth like rusted gears grinding together. Kael stared into its eyes, if they could be called that. And then, echo distortion, active. Warning, soul threshold breached. The moment froze. Color drained. The wind halted mid-howl. A ripple passed through the world. Kael felt himself split, or stretch, like his soul had left his skin behind. He saw it. Not just the hound, but its last moments. A memory. Bang. Orders. A name it was given and later forgotten. Unit Red Fong. And then it was gone. The creature collapsed. And Kael fell backward, gasping. Something hot moved beneath his ribs, like a spark embedded in flesh. Fragment captured. Relic instinct vestige. He passed out. When he woke, a fire crackled nearby. Not natural flame. This burned with a strange green-blue hue. It hissed like oil and sparked against the stones. A girl sat beside it, legs crossed, flipping a short dagger in one hand. The blade shimmered with inscribed runes that flared with every turn. She looked up when Kael stirred. Finally. Was starting to think I'd found a corpse that talked in its sleep. Kael blinked, confused. Who? Senna, she said, tossing him a small metal ration case. Don't bother thanking me. I only saved you because that hound was going to alert more. He tried to sit up. Pain answered. Careful, she muttered, tossing a vial toward him. Low-grade burn salve. Might help. Or make it worse. Roll the dice. He stared at her. She couldn't have been older than him, maybe 18. Wild red hair tied in a bandana. Fingerless gloves covered in soot. Smudged face. Eyes sharp enough to cut. He applied the salve, wincing. What are you doing out here? He asked. She raised an eyebrow. That's my line. You're not a runner. Not marked. Not armed. No lineage aura. So, what are you? Kael didn't answer. Not because he was hiding something, but because he didn't know. They sat in silence for a while. The wind howled outside the metal slab shelter they'd found, an old escape pod broken in half. Senna hummed while sharpening her dagger. Kael stared at the flickering flame. You used fire, he said quietly. Real fire. Not from a relic. She grinned. Flame path. My lineage kicked in 3 years ago during a cave collapse. Almost burned my own lungs out. She turned the blade in her hand. Now it's more of a controlled burn. Kael watched the flickers dance along her weapon. He didn't feel jealous. Just aware. She had something that worked. He had only a title that said he shouldn't exist. That night, as Kael drifted into exhausted sleep, the interface returned. But it looked different. The colors bled. Fragment detected. Relic instinct vestige. Class compatibility. Unknown. Corruption load 3%. Synchronization. Unstable. Side effect imminent. He felt heat in his fingers. They twitched violently. A vision flashed behind his eyes. Red overlays, motion calculations, instinct to pursue, tackle, tear. He gasped awake, chest heaving. A notification pulsed dimly. You have inherited instinct, but not control. One piece down. Your shape is no longer static. Senna hadn't been sleeping. She watched him jerk in his sleep, eyes moving behind shut lids, lips murmuring words in a broken, unfamiliar tongue. The light from the strange display flickered off his skin. When he finally settled, Senna stood, walked to the edge of the shelter and looked out into the darkness. Her voice was soft. Null class, huh? That's not possible. She glanced back. I've seen what happens when people try to hold more than one soul thread. Then to herself. And I've seen what it does to them. Kael woke to the sound of fire splitting stone. Senna stood 10 meters away, hurling twin flame-tipped daggers at rusted armor plates she'd propped up like training dummies. Each strike hit with surgical precision, leaving molten streaks behind. She didn't look at him when she spoke. Good. You're up. You need to move. Kael sat up, his joints aching. Can't I, just one more? No. She turned, face smudged with soot, eyes sharp. If you're staying with me, you learn or you die. This place eats the slow. Senna was relentless. She made him crawl through debris fields with a pack on his back. Forced him to build fires from rotted tech fiber. Had him spot echo zones by watching how shadows moved. She taught him to listen, to metal groaning beneath stone, to wind whistling in unnatural rhythms. And when the sun dipped low, she sparred with him. You hold a blade like a scholar, she said one evening. Stop thinking. Move. Kael lunged. She tripped him. Again. And again. And again. That night, Kael sat alone on the ridge. He tried to still his breathing. To reach into the warmth that pulsed faintly beneath his sternum, the place where the fragment lived. At first, nothing. Then whispers. Hunt. Tear. He gasped. His vision tinted red. The world seemed sharper, the shadows twitching with meaning. He stood too fast. His foot cracked a stone. The moment shattered. He collapsed, chest heaving. Far below, a creature howled. Later, as they sat by firelight, Senna sharpened her blades. My brother was like you, she said. Kael looked up. He took a fragment. Thought he could control it. Thought it made him special. She paused. He lasted a week. Woke up screaming one night, skin glowing like molten glass. Then he ran into the forest and never came back. Kael swallowed. I didn't choose this. No one does, she said. The world chooses. And it doesn't care if we survive it. On the 5th day, Senna pushed harder. She darted in with speed and flame, testing him. He dodged barely. She feinted high, kicked low. He grunted, stumbling. Faster, null boy. Don't think. Move. Kael growled. Something shifted. Suddenly the world slowed. Senna's body flared in red arcs, like his mind was tracing optimal paths. He lunged. Too fast. She parried, but barely. He advanced again, this time teeth clenched, muscles straining. A low snarl built in his throat. Kael? He didn't hear her. He moved like the hound. Instinct. Power. Speed. Until her dagger stopped inches from his neck. His eyes cleared. Senna stared at him, not with anger, but with fear. You weren't you for a second, she whispered. Pain exploded across Kael's chest. Corruption spike, 17%. Status, unstable. System warning, purge recommended. He dropped to his knees. Blood trickled from his nose. His muscles convulsed. He heard echoes. Voices. His own thoughts overlapping. The relic hound's instincts roared inside his skull. I can't breathe. And then silence. Kael woke in the shelter, shivering. Senna sat with her back to him, shoulders tense. You almost went over, she said softly. He didn't reply. I should have walked away. I've seen it before. Echo rot. They start shaking. Then bleeding. Then they stop being them. She stood, tossing him a fresh water capsule. But you looked scared. They don't get scared anymore. That night, Kael returned to the ridge. He closed his eyes. Focused. No rage. No fear. Just intent. He called to the fragment. Felt it stir. Then, moved. A single step. Fast. Controlled. He landed 10 feet forward, balanced. New technique registered. Pursuit pulse. Cooldown 12 seconds. Corruption cost, 1%. He smiled. It hurt. But he smiled. At dawn, Senna waited beside the fire, tossing a dagger lazily in the air. You look alive. That's something. Kael stood across from her. Again? He asked. She smirked. Again. And so they trained. Under ruin and stormlight. With bruises and blood. The first steps toward something new. Something broken. But growing. Ember steel, Senna said, tossing a charred bolt across her knuckles. Conducts runes like blood in a vein. Light, heat-resistant, and expensive as hell. Kael looked up from the campfire. Let me guess. You know where some is. Sort of. She pointed north. Old transport vault near the broken rail spine. Dangerous. Weird time shifts. Nobody stays long. Kael raised a brow. Echo zone? Senna nodded. Yeah. One of the bad ones. He didn't flinch. Instead he stood. When do we leave? She blinked. Then smirked. You're finally starting to sound like someone who wants to live. The ruins grew stranger the further they walked. Rust-cloaked bridges arched over craters lined with glowing blue moss. Stone pillars floated several feet off the ground, tethered by gravity fields Kael couldn't see. They passed half-melted statues of soldiers frozen mid-scream, remnants of a time-warp blast, Senna explained. Some echo zones collapse reality around them. Think of it like a bubble of the past, leaking. Kael said nothing, but he could feel it. The static in the air. The tremble under his boots. The whispering pull in his gut. Like the world was reaching for him. The entrance to the vault was jagged, metal torn open like a wound. Inside, light distorted. Dust hung still. Time moved wrong. Senna moved ahead, blade drawn. Stay close. Kael nodded, stepping in, and froze. For a split second he saw himself, just ahead, mirroring his movements. A translucent twin. It blinked away. His heart pounded. Then, in the reflection of a twisted wall panel, he saw something else. Himself, but older. Changed. Wrong. Eyes ringed with red. Arm covered in living metal. Runic scars down his throat. The older Kael turned. And smiled. He stood in the vault center. Kael didn't know how he got there. The world spun. His head rang. The other Kael stepped closer. Null class, he said, voice crackling. Free to shape yourself. Free to be ruined. Kael backed away. What are you? I'm what happens when you stop fighting the system and start using it. Every fragment. Every godless whisper. Every scrap of power. Kael raised his hands. You're not me. The older version tilted his head. Not yet. The vault pulsed. Light flickered. A rune flared on the ground, spiraling into Kael's body. Glitched rune acquired, Cinder Echo. Category, unstable/untranslated. Slot, glitch runes 1/3. Outside the distortion bubble, Senna faced a rising threat. A nearby pod hissed open, revealing a humanoid machine knight, body covered in bronze armor, one eye glowing blue. Soul Guardian, Vigil C1. Status, semi-aware. Core directive, defend the vault echo. It lunged. Senna moved like fire. Daggers danced. Sparks flew. Flame met alloy. But the Guardian adapted. She screamed as a blow struck her shoulder, sending her flying. Blood pooled. Her vision swam. But she crawled up, burned blade in hand. I don't die here. Kael dropped to one knee as the world realigned. The vision faded, but the runes stayed. His body trembled. System alerts rang in his head. Sync surge detected. Corruption load, 19%. New ability queued. Cinder Pulse locked 0/3 stabilizations required. He stood and ran. The world shimmered as he emerged from the vault heart, just in time to see Senna strike a desperate blow across the Soul Guardian's core. The machine reeled. Kael leapt in, slammed the shard of ember steel he picked up into the weakened joint, and drove it in deep. The machine spasmed and fell still. Senna panted. Kael collapsed beside her. No words. Just blood, fire, and silence. From a cliff high above, a figure watched. Robes of dark gray. Mask of silver etched with runes. He observed the vault, scanning the residual energy waves. Null class confirmed, he said softly. He raised a small orb. A pulse of blue light flared across it. All units, engage echo lockdown. The observer has awakened. Their footsteps echoed through broken tunnels as night swallowed the sky above. Kael limped, half carried by Senna. His shirt clung to his back, soaked with sweat. Every breath burned. The ember steel shard had cut him during the vault escape, but that wasn't what was killing him. It was the rune. Glitch runes 1/3. Cinder echo, unstable, internal containment breach detected. Corruption load, 22%. He stumbled again. Senna dragged him the last few steps into the shelter, an old signal station beneath the ridge. Stay awake, she snapped. Kael tried to speak. Couldn't. The world tilted sideways. He thrashed in his sleep. Fire licked up his throat. The rune pulsed beneath his skin, branding him from the inside. Senna knelt over him, eyes wild, a jagged flame sigil carved into her palm. This shouldn't work, she muttered. But if I don't, he's ash. She pressed her hand to his chest. Flame path ritual, ember bind initiated. Warning, cross-lineage marking forbidden by order law. Screw your law, she hissed. The mark flared, a spiral of fire threading into Kael's chest. He arched, screamed once, then went still. When Kael opened his eyes, everything was clearer. The pain was still there, but it had form now. Edges. Like the fire knew its limits. He sat up slowly. A strange warmth glowed beneath his shirt. He pulled the fabric back, and saw it. A blackened spiral, edged in red gold, etched over his heart like a brand. He touched it. Didn't burn. But something inside whispered. 3 times the flame must fall. Before the echo speaks true. Senna was silent for a long time. She sat across the shelter, staring at the wall. You shouldn't be alive, she said finally. Kael said nothing. That ritual, I've only seen it once. My brother used it on me when I first awakened. It burned for days. It's not meant for strangers. He looked at her. I'm not a stranger anymore. She didn't respond. But she didn't deny it either. Later, Kael asked, do you remember your family? She nodded slowly. Pieces. Laughter. Screaming. You. He hesitated. I was on a plane, he said. Flying to a place I'd never been. Then, sky cracked. World ended. Senna blinked. You're not from here. No. Doesn't matter, she said. Here's where you burn now. That night, Kael knelt on the ridge, torchlight flickering behind him. He breathed deep. Focused. Called the rune. A flicker of red shimmered along his arm, followed by searing pain. Technique attempt. Cinder pulse. Incomplete execution. Effect. Short-range combustion burst from palm, 1.2 m radius. Drawback. Minor muscle damage, left arm. He gritted his teeth. Did it again. Senna watched from the edge. Still think you're going to die? She called. He winced, grinning. Not today. Far away in a chamber lit by cold flame, Yarrick Thorn reviewed the report. Writ robes hung heavy on his frame. His eyes were bright and calculating. Null class observer. Name, Kael Vorrin. Glitch signature, active. Corruption load, rising. He closed the file. Spoke to the room. Ready my squad. A voice replied, metallic and cold. Target is unarmed. Local threat negligible. Not for long, Yarrick said. He's already bleeding the rules. Let's see how far the virus can spread before we quarantine. That night, Kael dreamed again. The world burned. He stood atop a tower wreathed in fire, below which people screamed and fought. Something massive loomed overhead, a great ring of shifting symbols. The sky bent inward. A voice whispered, if you cannot be contained, you must be chosen. He woke with a jolt, and the brand over his heart glowed softly in the dark. They were scouting a ruin when the world changed. No warning. No sound. The wind died. The sky dimmed. Kael's panel blinked. System alert. Order presence detected. Tracking signature. Writ authority class B/Bloodveil unit. Engagement probability, 91%. Senna, Kael said. We have to move. She didn't ask why. She just ran. They didn't get far. 3 figures emerged from the haze, cloaked in slate-gray armor laced with pulsing rune lines. Their faces were hidden behind polished masks etched with circular glyphs. Between them stalked a creature. Tall as a man, sleek like a panther, bones laced with chrome. Its muscles pulsed with twitching power. Red veins ran through its hide like glowing rivers. Warhound designation, Vorkin 13. Lineage core, blood/steel hybrid. Directive, null target capture. It spoke voice like gravel. Target verified. Null signature confirmed. Prepare for soul stabilization procedure. The lead keeper stepped forward. A woman's voice, calm and cold. You do not belong to any lineage. You are a corruption in the weave. Step forward and we will cleanse you. Painless. Final. Kael's jaw clenched. His panel buzzed violently. Fragment compatibility spike. Fusion thread opening, echo surge enabled. Hound plus Cinder, pairing sync, 42%. Senna stepped beside him, blades drawn. You're not touching him. The keeper tilted her head. Then we apply force. The warhound moved first. It was a blur of claws and metallic muscle. Kael barely dodged, using pursuit pulse to sidestep a killing blow. A spray of sparks exploded as the beast sliced into a stone outcrop. Senna leapt into motion, daggers flaring with fire. She intercepted one of the keepers in a clash of heat and rune steel. Kael turned and fired Cinder Pulse, a blast of flame from his palm. The warhound staggered. But it didn't fall. Instead, it adapted. Eyes glowed. Blood-tech limbs twisted. Its runes flared crimson. It was learning. Kael's chest burned. The flame mark over his heart pulsed. The whispers returned. Track. Burn. Lunge. He let go. Let the fragments twist. Fusion temporary unlocked. Hound flame lunge. Effect. Combines tracking instinct plus combustion momentum into a high-speed impact lunge. Destroys shielding. Partial loss of motor control post-use. Corruption spike, plus 8%. Kael moved. A blur of red light and heat. He struck the warhound square in the chest. The impact shattered the beast's ribs, burning through flesh and plating alike. It howled, a broken sound, and crumpled dead. Kael collapsed. His arm twitching. His vision flickering. The world swam. The remaining keeper broke from Senna and fled into the wastes. Senna ran to Kael, knelt beside him, checked his pulse. You idiot, she whispered. You absolute echo-burned idiot. He looked up, barely conscious. It worked. Yeah, she muttered, lifting him to his feet. And it almost cooked your brain. Back in their camp, Kael sat alone beside the dying fire. His panel glitched with every breath. Corruption load, 32%. Glitched rune, stabilized phase 1. Fusion slot, locked, cooldown, 6 hours. Senna sat down beside him. Neither spoke. Until finally she said, That thing you did. He nodded. She turned to him, eyes hard. That wasn't a power. That was a fracture. He looked up. I know. Yerrick Thorne stood before the council, 3 figures veiled in static screens, each representing one of the core writ orders. Archive, Logic, and Flame. The anomaly is alive, Yerrick said. He survived echo saturation, hybrid fusion, and direct combat with a warhound unit. And your squad failed, one voice responded, clipped and cold. He's learning. Fast. Another voice replied, then containment is no longer acceptable. The third simply said, deploy her. A moment later, the chamber darkened. Chains clinked. From the side door emerged Ares Vok, the blood veil purifier. Her eyes glowed the color of faded wounds. Kael sat cross-legged beside the fire, the ember's teal shard balanced in his palm. The brand over his heart glowed faintly. He etched the sigil from the vault memory, the cinder echo glyph, into the shard surface using scavenged flint. Then he pushed echo energy into it. The rune reacted. Too violently. It flared, seared the air, cracked stone, and exploded in a burst of heatless flame. Kael gasped, recoiling. When the smoke cleared, the shard was blackened. The rune was gone. But something lingered. Tiny particles of red glow ash danced in the air, humming with faint resonance. That night, Kael asked, You knew a purifier? Senna stared into the fire. I knew what they left behind. Her voice was low. My brother, Ren, he was flame and echo. Rare pairing. When he unlocked his second path, the writ branded him as a deviation. Kael said nothing. They offered cleansing. He refused. She turned her hand, showing a faded scar burned across her palm, half-healed, uneven. I tried to bind him to my mark. It wasn't enough. The purifier cut the thread out of him. Not killed. Erased. Kael met her eyes. That's what they want to do to me? No, she said. That's what they will do. Kael couldn't sleep. He returned to the burned shard, touched the blackened surface. The residue shimmered, then shifted. Soul thread detected, incomplete echo memory. Would you like to anchor fragment? Kael hesitated, then whispered, yes. A single flicker of memory entered his mind. A moment, someone carving a rune into stone, their hands trembling, their voice calm. Not power. Not battle. A man teaching. Smiling. Sharing knowledge. Kael exhaled. They're not just fragments, he whispered. They're pieces of people. A comm drone buzzed overhead at dawn. Senna caught it with a weighted throw. The message crystal inside glowed. RIT deployments active. Purifier confirmed. 2 squads incoming. Scavenger routes compromised. They had 2 choices, run to a trade city, or go deeper into the Deadlands toward the breach line. Kael stood. They're coming because I broke something. Senna looked up. Then we break it wider. He smiled grimly. That's the plan. Ares Vok walked alone. She did not need a unit. She needed no scouts. Only purpose. Her twin blades sheathed across her back pulsed with faint red-gold light. Obey. Undo. She passed through a storm front untouched, time flickering as echo feedback folded around her. A single panel hovered in front of her, stitched into reality. Target, Kael Vorrin. Designation, Null Class Observer. Status, free. Accept deletion directive? She whispered. Yes. They stood at the edge of the world. The breach line yawned before them, hundreds of meters across, as if something ancient had clawed into the planet's flesh. Stormlight rippled inside the rift, flickering between moments that didn't match. Rocks hovered midair. Some rain fell up. Kael's panel glitched just by looking at it. Caution, echo density level, critical. Spatial drift, 11% per hour. Stability halftime, 2.8 hours. Senna looked down. No one climbs back out the way they came. Kael exhaled. Then we go forward. They descended slowly, Senna using anchored hooks and Kael scrambling with caution. The stone shifted under his hands, sometimes warm, sometimes cold. 30 meters down, they reached the outer shell of an ancient vault city, half buried in the canyon wall. Runes long dead flickered faintly on crumbling doors. They entered. Inside time echoed. Every footstep Kael took felt like 2. Old machines lined the halls, wrapped in black corrosion and vines. Some whispered in static. Others pulsed with red light. System layer echoes detected. Archive, Protoclass Facility Rendhol Prime. Access, locked/echo only. Kael touched a cracked terminal, curiosity outweighing caution. The world tore sideways. He fell. Into a body not his own. Into memories not his own. Into Rendhol. He stood in a lab, surrounded by glyphs and floating sigil pylons. Outside the city burned. Sirens wailed. An override command echoed in the air. Prototype class, unfit. Erase path integrity. Rendhol screamed back into the system, I made myself. You don't get to unmake me. Then came the light. Bang. Finality. Kael gasped, coughing, stumbling backward from the terminal. His heart raced. His body shook. Senna ran to him, grabbing his shoulders. Kael, you were screaming. I saw him. Rendhol. He built his own power. No lineage. No class. Just will. He stared at his hand. I know how to make my own. They found a forge alcove, old, broken, but functional. Kael took the ember steel shard. Drew from his memory. Mixed his blood. Focused. Syntax initiated. Custom sigil design. Base thread. Relic instinct. Core amplifier. Echo cinder memory. Stability lattice. Manual weave. The rune flared, burning white, then cooling into shape. Kael pressed it into a gauntlet plate. New rune acquired. Bound instinct. Effect. Heighten reflexes and perception for 30 seconds. Drawback. Nerve backlash 12-hour cooldown. Stability rating, 78%. He collapsed but smiling. High above, Ares Vok stepped through a warp arch at the crater's rim. Time bent around her like silk in water. She knelt, pressing 2 fingers to the dust. She saw the rune. The fracture. The echo. She whispered. Prototype reborn. Rendhol's echo lives. She rose. I'll carve the lesson back into the world. He didn't feel stronger. He didn't feel faster. He felt wrong. The world sharpened into jagged edges. Sounds became too loud. Smells too distinct. He could hear the faint hum of Senna's breath. The metallic tick of a broken pipe a dozen meters behind them. The vibration of stone under his boots like a heartbeat. And then the thoughts came. Not his. They will never let you build your own path. They will erase it. You must act before they do. Kael stumbled against the wall, fingers digging into the ruined steel for balance. Senna turned instantly. Kael? He gritted his teeth, breathing in through his nose, out through clenched lips. The rune's glow dimmed slowly on the gauntlet. The sensation faded, but it left behind a feeling like oil on the back of his tongue. A whisper that didn't belong. I'm fine, Kael said, voice dry. The rune works. Yeah, Senna said warily. But does everything else? The breach line deepened beneath them, turning into a maze of collapsed vaults, fractured corridors, and shattered data towers. They traveled for hours, sometimes in silence, sometimes through whispers, Senna charting the path forward, Kael trailing behind her, listening to every echo. Some weren't echoes from the ruins. Some were from inside. He could feel Rendhel's presence now. Not like a ghost. Not a voice. More like a memory burned too deep to scrub away. A soul stain. He started recognizing places in the ruins before they turned corners. The hallway with the split pillar. The chamber where the power core failed. The ceiling crack shaped like a claw. Kael hadn't seen them before. But Rendhel had. They found the first corpse near an old power relay. Half buried in dust and shattered crystal, its armor twisted into flesh. Runes had melted into bone. No weapon remained. Senna crouched beside it. This wasn't writ work, she murmured. They don't leave bodies. Kael crouched, inspecting the warped sigils. They're layered, like something rewrote the body. Echo beast, Senna said grimly. Not a natural one. Probably born from a dead path fragment. They cling to places where lineages bled out. Kael's stomach tightened. What kind of fragment? She didn't answer. They moved slower after that. Kael's rune began to pulse again, unprompted. A soft heat on the back of his hand. A warning. When they passed a shattered window, Kael turned to look, and saw something watching them from across the cavern. Massive. Wrong. Its limbs were built like a hound's, but reversed, joints bending the wrong way. Its body flickered with distortion as if it was built from pieces of time. One of its eyes pulsed red. The other was a mirror. Kael stepped back. Senna didn't see it. When Kael turned back, it was gone. Later, while resting in an old relay chamber, Kael sat alone and tried to meditate, like Rendhel had, like he'd done after absorbing the fragment. But it wasn't peace that greeted him. It was a room of light and code. Runic symbols floated in the air, broken and reassembling themselves. He stood in it, within the memory but with full awareness. Rendhel appeared across the chamber, skin flickering with unstable glyphs. His voice was strained but focused. If you take it, you carry it. The system always charges a price. Not in mana. In memory. Kael approached. You fought them. Tried to build something new. Rendhel nodded. And I failed. Why show me this? Because you haven't yet. A rune burned between them, a hybrid of flame, instinct, and something deeper. Kael reached for it. Pain exploded across his head. He woke gasping. Blood trickled from his nose. His eyes stung. Senna knelt beside him, hand gripping his shoulder. That's the second time you've screamed out of nowhere. I was in the echo again, Kael whispered. With him. Senna's gaze hardened. You're not just copying power anymore, are you? Kael looked down at his shaking hands. No. I'm absorbing people. It came after nightfall. They had just found a half-functional lift shaft when the walls groaned. Lights flickered. A low, droning howl rolled through the ruins, less a sound, more a wave of pressure. Senna stood, blades drawn. That's not a system fault. Kael's panel flashed violently. Echo entity, unknown prototype rejection. Warning, fragment linkage detected, Rendhel class, aberrant. Recommended action, FLE. Kael's breath caught. It's connected to him. It's one of the failures. The beast stepped from the shadows behind them. It didn't roar. Remembered? Rendhel, it said in a distorted, inhuman voice. You survived. Kael stepped forward, body shaking. I'm not him. It paused. But you carry him. The thing moved like lightning, shifting between forms, limbs extending and collapsing like clockwork breaking down. Kael used bound instinct, eyes flashing gold, mind syncing with the beast's motion. He dodged the first strike. Barely. Senna was already in motion, flames coiling around her, blades flaring like wings. The corridor lit with fire and distortion. Kael's mind split with every movement. Every second, Rendhel's memories tried to override him, urging him to use the prototype core to break the fusion limit to become more. Kael refused. He didn't want to become Rendhel. He wanted to survive as himself. The beast weakened. Senna landed a final blow, dagger driven deep into the mirrored eye. Kael caught its collapse, lowered it to the floor as it convulsed. It looked up at him. You carried the pain. Kael nodded. I will. So no one else has to. The creature smiled, a terrible broken thing. Then faded into light. Far above, Ares Vok reached the outer rim of the ruins. She touched the air, felt the burned threads of echo where Kael had fought. 3 deaths in the corridor, she whispered. And 1 memory preserved. She unsheathed obey. Then undo. This one is learning. Good. Let's see if he can learn to survive me. The breach line had teeth. The deeper they went, the more it bled into shapes that made no sense. Gravity pulsed sideways. Light refused to commit to one source. Walls flickered between metal, stone, and bone-like substance Kael refused to name. But then they found it. A dome of obsidian and molten brass, sunk deep into the ruin's heart. It pulsed with faint blue light, not bright but alive. Senna crouched beside a twisted arch of runed iron. That's it, she said. A source node. Kael stepped forward. His panel pulsed without command. Root system core detected. Status, independent, unbound. Warning, contact may trigger resonance event. I can feel it, Kael said quietly. Like it's looking at me. Senna didn't move. Are you sure about this? No, Kael admitted. But this time, I'm not taking someone else's echo. I'm going to shape mine. Kael stepped into the node chamber. It responded. Rings of light lifted from the ground, scanning his body, projecting symbols he'd never seen, half-written glyphs searching for a match that didn't exist. Classification, null. System integration, rejected. Manual override, possible. Would you attempt custom fragment encoding? Warning, irreversible. Yes, Kael whispered. The chamber darkened. He was pulled inward, not physically but soul first, into a place between thought and system. Floating glyphs drifted like leaves in a storm. Thread lines of memory swirled around him. He reached for one, felt the burn of ancient code. Words flooded his head. Lineages are fences. We built them to control outcomes. But there were once doors. This is not a lineage. It is a fracture waiting to become shape. Kael reached forward and pushed himself into the system. His chest burned. His skin cracked like porcelain under pressure. He screamed. But he did not break. When he opened his eyes, a single glyph hovered above his hand, burned into the metal of his gauntlet. A new rune. His own. Fragment created, ether-bound instinct. Class hybrid. Base. Relic instinct plus flame echo plus root code thread. Effect. Track movement of all entities within 20 m for 10 seconds. Reflex spike. System targeting glitch to enemies. Drawback. Pulse lockout, 1 minute. Mild neural drift. Kael collapsed to his knees, chest heaving. Senna rushed in. Are you okay? He nodded slowly. I made it, he whispered. She moved like the silence between strikes. Ares Vok stepped into the breach line as if the storms parted for her. Her presence alone distorted echo strands. A RIT drone hovered beside her, glowing pale. Resonance spike detected. Class unknown. Echo root exposure verified. She did not smile. Ares had forgotten how long ago. Instead, she walked forward and whispered to the ruin. Let the test begin. They met her in the outer vault chamber, Senna with blades drawn, Kael barely standing, the rune on his hand still glowing faint. Ares stood calmly, cloak hanging still despite the flickering air. Kael Vorrin, she said. Null class anomaly. You've trespassed in a system that was never meant to allow shape without order. Kael didn't respond. Ares lifted one hand. Submit to stabilization. We will purge your corrupted threads and assign you a compatible lineage. You will be normalized. No, Kael said. Her eyes narrowed. You are dangerous. Not because of what you've taken, but because you refuse to stop taking. Even the RIT failed to anticipate this rate of fusion. I'm not stealing, Kael said. I'm building. Ares tilted her head. And what will you do when the voices in your head are louder than your own? Her second hand moved. Combat state, purifier mode engaged. Permission to delete, authorized. Then die, she said. Kael moved. Faster than before. Ether-bound instinct flared. His vision overlaid with glowing paths, enemy vectors highlighted in red. His body moved not with reaction, but with anticipation. He ducked the first slash of undo, a blade that pulsed with anti-memory. His mind screamed. He struck back with a blast of cinder pulse, but Ares parried with one elegant motion. "I've fought better anomalies," she said. Kael panted. "Then let's see if you survive a new one." Kael called every thread he had. The system screamed. "Warning, fusion sequence exceeding tolerance. Class type, unknown, prototype class formation detected. Title unlocked, the one who breaks. You are not a class. You are a question. Do you wish to remain unnamed?" Kael whispered. "Yes." Ares struck again and Kael caught the blade. He shouldn't have. But for one moment the prototype form held. And Ares hesitated. Just for a breath. Kael blasted her back with an unstable fusion of flame and instinct, burning her cloak, searing the floor. She landed cleanly, but stepped back. And smiled. She turned. "You're not ready yet," she said. "But you will be." Kael fell to his knees, the system screaming in his skull, corruption spiking. Senna ran to him, cradling his head. "Kael, stay with me." His panel pulsed violently. Corruption load, 61%. Instability rating, 4 out of 5. Mind echo interference, active. He opened his eyes. "Senna." "I'm here," she said. "Don't move. Don't speak. Just breathe." She held him until the trembling stopped. Later, when the system calmed and the air was still, Kael sat at the edge of the source node, watching it flicker. Senna sat beside him. She didn't speak for a long time. Then, "You scared me," she said. "I scared me," Kael admitted. "You're not the only one in there anymore, are you?" "No." "Can you stay you?" "I don't know." Senna looked at the brand over his heart, still pulsing faintly. "I'll stay until you forget me," she said. Kael smiled. "Then I'll never forget." Far across the continent, a writ archive lit with crimson lines as Yarrick Thorne watched the data pulse. Prototype formation. Blood veil retreat. System response delayed. He poured a glass of ash wine. "So," he whispered. He chose to be unnamed. He raised the glass to the screen. To the next war, then. Kael dreamed in languages he'd never learned. He walked hallways of glass and wind, where books whispered and statues wept code from cracked faces. Sometimes he was Rendell. Sometimes someone else, an archivist with golden eyes, a warrior who walked backward through time. But always the dream ended the same. A mirror. His face. But not quite. Something behind the eyes didn't belong. He woke with a gasp, chest heaving, the rune over his heart burning like a second sun. Senna sat nearby, sharpening a blade. She didn't look up when she said, "It's getting worse." Kael said nothing. She did. "You're slipping." They walked through wind-scoured canyons for 2 days, tracing the path Senna remembered from old scavenger maps. Towering statues, long toppled, lined the cliffside, heroes of the old world, their names long erased. Kael's system panel remained dim, flickering as if the land around them disrupted more than signal. "It's here," Senna said on the third morning. The valley narrowed into a black gap between stone ridges. In its center, the tower without a name. It didn't reach the sky. It swallowed it. No birds flew near it. No system glyphs hovered in its air. Kael felt it before he saw it. Like the universe refused to recognize the tower's existence. The first step was the hardest. The moment Kael crossed the threshold, his thoughts stuttered. Not from fear. From displacement. The system tried to read the tower. Failed. Exception. Locality cannot be indexed. System query returned. Null. Recommendation. Evacuate. He ignored it. Inside time bet. The walls were there but not. More like shadows pretending to be stone. As they walked, torches lit with memory, flickering in colors Kael didn't have names for. They reached a room with a central dais, a stone slab floating midair, circled by chains that didn't touch anything. Senna stayed near the wall. Kael stepped forward. When he touched the slab, the tower pulled him under. No vision. No darkness. Just understanding. He stood in a great hall of light and wire beside a tall, robed figure. Genderless. Ageless. Eyes like broken stars. "We built lineages to control. But before them we made anchors, to endure." Kael asked nothing. The figure placed a burning sigil in his chest, like the mark Senna had once given him, but deeper. "Older. You carry too many. You must choose what part of you is real." Then he was gone. Kael stood alone. A mirror appeared. He stepped close. His reflection didn't match. Not fully. Kael's mirror self was calm. Cold. Unburdened. He smiled. "I gave up the weight. I surrendered memory. Now I'm clean." Kael clenched his fists. "You're not me. I'm the version who can survive." Kael looked into his own eyes and saw nothing. He whispered, "I'd rather break carrying something real than live clean as a stranger." The mirror shattered. Light filled him. Pain right behind it. The system screamed. Fragment instability. Critical. Warning, prototype class cannot stabilize. Alternate path selected. Manual anchoring. Initiating soul anchor core. Would you burn everything false to protect what is real? Yes, Kael whispered. Then fire. Memory. Collapse. He fell. And the anchor formed. Senna caught him before he hit the stone. His chest glowed, not the runes, not the interface. Something alive, burning behind the brand. He convulsed. Senna pulled him close, held him like she had in the node. "You idiot," she whispered, eyes wet. "You're making yourself into something the world doesn't understand." He opened his eyes, weak but focused. "That's the point." Ares stood before the Council of Iron Flame. She bowed, not out of respect but ritual. Subject Kael Vorrin has initiated a prototype form, survived a mirror trial, and forged a soul anchor. The central figure leaned forward. "You believe he is no longer prey?" Ares nodded. "I request dualist authority. Let him grow. If he's false, I'll erase him myself." The council considered. And agreed. That night, Kael dreamt again. He walked a field of black glass, fire in the distance. A child stood before him, no older than 7. Same face. Same eyes. "Who are you?" Kael asked. The boy smiled sadly. "I'm who you were before you needed power." Kael's voice cracked. "Do I still need you?" The child nodded. "You just need to remember what you were trying to protect." Kael knelt, held him, then woke up, eyes clear for the first time in days. Kael didn't speak as they left the tower. He wasn't avoiding Senna. He just didn't know which voice in his head was truly his yet. Since forging the soul anchor, the echoes had gone quiet, but not gone. They rested deeper now, behind thought, behind instinct. Not screaming anymore. Waiting. Senna kept her distance, glancing at him when she thought he wasn't looking. She didn't ask how he felt. She didn't have to. He walked like someone who'd been cracked, and reassembled just slightly wrong. The road had no name. Senna only called it what her brother once did. "The Ash Road," she said as they reached the rise. "Where the forgers used to move the fragments before the writ outlawed them." Kael looked out. Miles of broken stone, gray dust, scorched wagons half sunken into the earth. Towers long collapsed, their watch runes faded. The air shimmered not with heat but memory. Every few steps Kael heard things. A child's laughter. A sword drawn. A whisper, "I never wanted to forget you." He tightened his cloak. The memories weren't his. But they could have been. They saw him on the second night. A hunched figure limping through the dust, muttering to himself. Pale skin etched with runes that flickered red and gray. One eye socket burned hollow. The other glowed. Kael stepped forward instinctively. Senna grabbed his wrist. "Wait." But the man saw them. And smiled. "Did you anchor?" "I anchored once. Or twice. I forget. There were voices. Many. I carried them. Carried them too long." He staggered close. Kael froze. This thing had once tried what he had done. A failed prototype. The man's skin pulsed with light. Fragments emerged from his arms, glitches made physical. Bits of flame, steel, and pulse fighting for control. Kael's panel screamed warnings. Subject unstable. Echo drift level 5. Cognitive collapse, 94%. Recommendation, disengage. But Kael didn't move. He watched. The man screamed suddenly, grabbed his own head, and began to repeat himself. "I burned for her. I burned for her. I burned for her. I burned." Then he collapsed, and did not rise. They buried him the next morning. Senna didn't speak until Kael finished covering the last of the body. Then she sat beside him in the dust. "You think that's you someday?" Kael nodded. "Yeah." "You're wrong," she said quietly. "You're scared. That's different." He stared out over the ruined horizon. "How do you carry this much and not collapse?" Senna rested her head on her knees. "You don't. You carry it anyway." That night, under stars that flickered like they were being rewritten, Kael sat beside the fire. Senna across from him, polishing one blade. He spoke. "I'm done stealing." She looked up. He held out his hand, palm facing the sky. The brand glowed softly over his heart. "I'll still take fragments. Still absorb. Still fight. But from now on, if I take something, I learn its name. Its story. I remember it. A beat. Every echo I take, I make part of me. With respect." Senna studied him, then nodded. I'll hold you to it. Miles away, in a sealed chamber below the Rit Citadel, Yarrick Thorn stood before a cradle of glass and silver. Inside floated a humanoid form, unfinished, growing fast. A construct, laced with Kael's copied interface data, partial soul mimicry, and a synthetic anchor core. Don't chase him, Yarrick said to the technicians. Watch him. Mirror his path. Every choice. Every deviation. He placed a hand on the glass. He'll teach us how to undo him. The construct opened its eyes and smiled. I will learn how he breaks. Kael and Senna walked the road for another day in silence. The sky had shifted colors again, violet this time, fading to blood orange near the mountains. Dust rose behind them. Not from wind, but from something following. A thin, pulsing red thread now trailed Kael's footsteps, glowing faintly, pulsing with rhythm. Not threatening. Not watching. Just waiting. Senna noticed first. She didn't speak, but she walked closer to him after that, just in case. The vault still burned even after a century. Ash coated every surface, fine silver-gray dust that glowed faintly in the dark. Black towers rose in silence. Fire did not consume them. It clung to them like memory refused to fade. Kael and Senna stepped carefully, boots crunching over bones, half-melted steel, and remnants of armor fused into glass. Place still breathes fire, Senna muttered. This city used to be a beacon. Twin flame wardens ran it. Protected people with real power. Then it ended. Hard. Kael's system pulsed without command. Local echo threads detected. Warning, dual fragment conflict, selection required. He didn't flinch. Something was calling to him. Two pillars waited. One glowed red gold, runes dancing like sunrises. The other pulsed dark, a black ember that breathed in reverse. Kael approached the first. He was pulled in. Ariste. She stood tall, shoulders scarred, eyes steady. She laughed beside her battle partner, then screamed as they fell. Her hand never left the sword. She burned not to kill but to shield. Her last act, holding back a collapse long enough for innocence to flee. Power isn't about outlasting. It's about choosing who you die for. Then Kael was thrown into the second pillar. Her voice was colder. Her eyes twin stars of fury. I chose to survive. She chose to die. She walked away from her partner. Rewrote her soul. Let the fire consume everyone so she could be the brightest. Loyalty is a chain. Break it, and ascend. Kael collapsed between the pillars, chest heaving, eyes wide. Senna ran to him. What did you see? Two endings. One, broken with love. The other, whole with rage. System prompt. Only one fragment may integrate. Grief-born flame Ariste. Wrath-born flame Valis Karen. Senna gripped his arm. Think before you decide. Rage is clean. But grief stays. Kael stared at the gold rune pillar and stepped toward it. It didn't burn. It ached. As the flame entered him, Kael saw it all, Eris's fear, her strength, the moment she realized she would die, and the choice she made to do it protecting someone she loved. He felt it. Not like an echo. Like he had been her. He dropped to his knees. Tears streamed down his cheeks, unbidden. Senna knelt beside him, not speaking. Kael gasped. It hurts, but it's real. She didn't answer. She just placed her hand on his. They waited in silence. Kael's system pulsed. New flame fragment integrated. Name, Grief-born flame Ariste. Ability, Last Ember Wall. Auto triggers on near-fatal impact to shield allies. Once per system cycle. Drawback, emotional flooding low, mid-risk. Side note, echo permanence, 100%. Kael whispered, she's not leaving. Senna finally spoke. Because she doesn't want to be forgotten. Far away, the mirror stood in silence, a matching vault before it. It made the opposite choice. Valis Karen's rage ignited within. No tears. No weight. No grief. Only purpose. Flame fragment integrated, Wrath-born flame. Ability, Soulburst Lance. Pure damage burst attack, no defensive properties. User enters focus state, 15 seconds. Ignores all echo interference. The mirror looked skyward. I will burn without breaking. Unlike him. As they left the vault, Kael looked back only once. The pillars no longer glowed. They were ash now. Like everything else. Grief doesn't feel like power, he said. Senna replied, "It isn't. That's why it lasts longer." He looked at her. "Thank you for walking this far with me." She met his eyes. "I'll keep walking. But if you stop being you, I'll be the one who ends it." He nodded, then smiled. "Then I'll keep choosing." The world had grown thinner. Stone spires jutted from the earth like broken clock hands, all leaning in the same direction, as if pulled by memory instead of gravity. Kael and Senna stepped carefully. The land here was unstable. Not in the physical sense but something deeper. Kael's panel flickered every few steps. Once it showed a memory projection. Once it showed a heartbeat that wasn't his. Region, threat spine zone. Danger class, medium, high cognitive drift. Destination, Weaver's Edge, 13.6 kilometers. They moved toward it, toward the place where old paths were rewoven. But fate had other ideas. The scouts found them at the third ridge. "Breaker. He's here." Kael froze. 4 villagers approached, falling to their knees. One wept openly. Another held out a half-burned relic shard. Senna stepped forward, hand on her blade. "We're just passing." "No," one woman said. "He saved us. He burned the writ down. He said we'd never kneel again." Kael looked at her, voice low. "I've never been here." They didn't hear him. They only saw the cloak, the eyes, the brand. They saw their myth. That night Harrow Vale opened its gates. The village was little more than a circle of broken homes, but its people glowed with something brighter than survival. Hope. They fed Kael and Senna. Told stories. "He came 3 nights ago. Killed 3 writ enforcers. One with a glare. Said we didn't need to beg for relic crumbs anymore. His fire burned clean. Not like the others. He said his name. Kael." Kael stared into the fire. A flicker of mirrored silver crossed his thoughts. The construct. It was here. Kael walked through the ashes of the writ camp the villagers showed him. The ground was blackened. Bones vaporized. Markings gone. This wasn't self-defense. This was execution. Senna stood beside him. "They think you freed them." "I didn't," Kael whispered. "I wasn't even here. But you're the one they believe in." He turned to her. "That's not me." "No," she said. "But maybe it's the version of you that wins." They sat together beneath a dead tree. Kael couldn't sleep. Senna finally spoke. "You're afraid of being remembered wrong." He didn't answer, so she kept going. "You carry pieces of other people. Fragments. Echoes. And now someone else is carrying you. Without soul. Without fear." She touched his hand. "So choose what you want to be remembered for. Not what you want to be mistaken for." Kael closed his eyes and let the weight settle. He dreamed of fire. Of walking through flames without pain. Of killing writ scouts without emotion. Of villagers kneeling. Of hearing them chant his name. Kael. 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 He woke up gasping. Hands shaking. He remembered the kills. The looks on their faces. The mercy he didn't give. Memory sync detected. External link source. Error. Possible interference. Artificial echo thread alignment. The mirror was leaking into him. High above Harrow Vale, the mirror sat on a ridge, watching the Real Kael walk the camp it had burned. It hummed quietly. One Kael hadn't hummed since Earth. "He dreams in my voice now. Soon, he'll forget which thoughts were his." The mirror stood. "They love me more than they loved him." It turned north. "Now let's see what I can become." Before they left, Kael stood in the center of Harrow Vale. He spoke softly. "I'm not the god you think I am." An old man stepped forward. "No. You're the one we needed anyway." Kael said nothing. But as he turned away, he whispered to Senna. "I won't let him write my story." She nodded. "Then let's go write your next page." They walked on. And the ash blew behind them, red threads dancing in the wind. The bridge to Weaver's Edge was made of stone so thin it looked like spun glass. Thousands of thread lines curved in spiral patterns beneath it, pulsing dimly in the wind. They weren't cords of rope. They were memories, each strand humming faint echoes from forgotten lives. Kael heard them. "I never meant to leave her." "Do it. Burn me. Take it. We should have chosen grief instead of power." Senna heard nothing. She watched Kael's face tighten with every step. "What are they saying to you?" she asked. Kael didn't answer, because he couldn't tell if the words were from the bridge, or from inside himself. At the bridge's end, the loom sat like a cocoon of light and shadow. A half-machine, half-organic sphere, resting atop fractured stone veins. It pulsed not with light, but memory pressure, like the weight of eyes that had already cried all they could. Weaver's Edge detected. Access granted. Soul anchor registered. Fragment slots available for fusion. 2. Initiating sync thread analysis. Kael's panel filled with motion. Senna stepped back, tense. Kael, what happens if the loom doesn't like what it sees? Kael stepped forward. Then I'll learn to like what I become. Time broke. Sound became light. Kael floated in an impossible space, shards of memory orbiting him like stars. Fragments pulsed nearby. Grief-born flame. Relic instinct. 2 pieces, both scarred. Both half-lives. Fusion thread, stable pairing. Trade required. 1 personal memory, unfragmented only. A menu opened before him. Each entry pulsed with an image. His first echo fragment. Senna's first half-smile after saving him. The vault where Eris died. His brother's voice on a rooftop at night back on Earth. That one glowed brighter. The loom whispered, "Your anchor is strong. But to shape something new you must let go of 1 stitch." Senna's voice cut through the loom's hum. It wasn't supposed to reach here, but something about Kael's anchor let her see. "Kael, not that one." He turned. In this place her eyes shimmered. Real. Desperate. "That memory, your brother? Kael, that's your reason. The first time you ever said you'd protect someone." He touched the memory. The warmth was real. But his hand closed anyway. "I remember why," he said. "Even if I forget who." Light split the loom. The 2 fragments twisted, warped, harmonized. Pain surged, his soul screaming, reshaping, threading through fire and instinct. And then clarity. New ability gained, Emberstep Guardian. Effect. Manifest soul echo for 5 seconds. Echo mirrors user and intercepts 1 fatal strike intended for ally. Cooldown 18 hours. Memory burn. Complete. Memory deleted. Earth, rooftop voice. Kael staggered. Then fell. Senna caught him before he hit stone. His eyes were distant, but not empty. "You okay?" "I think so," he said. "But there's a hole." He tried to remember why he'd made his first promise to protect people. It was gone. But something deeper remained. Senna whispered, "What did you give up?" He hesitated. "Someone who once told me I was meant to look out for others." She swallowed hard. "And now?" He closed his eyes. "I still believe it. I just don't remember why." Elsewhere, the mirror stood before the loom. Tried to enter. It didn't scream. It didn't glitch. It simply rejected him. Access denied. No soul thread detected. The mirror tilted its head. "I'll fix that." A scavenger passed nearby. The mirror reached out, grabbed the man's head, and stole a memory. Not the power. Just the why behind it. Memory acquired, daughter's name, Lyra. The mirror smiled. "Now I have a reason." Back at the loom's bridge, Kael stood with Senna as the sun rose. The thread shimmered. 1 strand near his foot began to pulse. A red thread. Not from the loom. From him. He reached down, touched it. The thread moved. And somewhere in the distance, the loom whispered, "You've sewn something never meant to exist." Kael whispered back, "Then I'll learn to wear it anyway." Kael hadn't activated the fragment since the loom. He could feel it, Emberstep Guardian, like a second breath in his chest. Always ready. Always watching. It didn't hum with power. It hummed with presence. Senna kept glancing at him. Not with distrust, but with fear wrapped in care. She wanted to ask what it felt like. He didn't have the words. How do you explain what it feels like to know a part of you is waiting to protect someone else? And what if that part starts acting on its own? The thread fields were quiet, dead stalks of colorless grass stretching for miles, once used to channel echo signals before the system fell. That silence broke with steel. 3 Rit scouts emerged from the shadowed ridge. And behind them, 1 breaker. A Rit elite. Wielding twin thread weapons, coiling like black veins that shimmered with latent motion. Senna swore. "They've been tracking your loom signature." Kael didn't hesitate. Ability activate, Emberstep Guardian. Echo projection forming. Duration, 5 seconds. He stepped forward. And a second Kael appeared beside him. Made of flickering fire and memory thread. It looked at the Rit enforcer. Then stepped in front of Senna. The breaker's strike came fast, faster than Kael could block. But the echo moved first. It caught the blade, held it, then turned its head, and said in Kael's voice, "You always look out for people, Kael. That's your thing." Kael's knees buckled. Senna gasped. The Rit enforcer blinked, then burned as a fire burst from the echo's palm ignited his veins. Kael collapsed. The echo vanished. And the world spun. His system interface glitched. Emergence event detected. Warning, echo autonomy spike 8%. Quote origin, memory fragment. Erased. Kael lay shaking on the ground. Senna stood over him. You didn't program that line, she said. He shook his head. I can't remember where it's from. She knelt, holding his face between her hands. Kael, that wasn't just an echo. That was a person. A piece of you thought was gone. He closed his eyes. I didn't mean for it to live. She didn't answer. Because they both knew what was really terrifying. It did. They found shelter in the broken husk of a communication tower. Kael sat cross-legged beside a shattered terminal, flame curling softly over his knuckles. He accessed the fragment. Normally it would show runes, stats, lines of code. But now, fragment, Ember Step Guardian, behavioral log, one new line added. You always look out for people, Kael. That's your thing. Not system-coded. Not replayed. Written. Kael's fingers trembled. He whispered, it remembers me better than I do. Elsewhere, under a collapsed cathedral of broken skyglass, the mirror stood before two survivors. A man and a woman. Hiding. Holding each other. The man said, if we die, just remember I tried to protect you. The mirror tilted its head. Sync initiated. Emotional intent logged. Love, sacrifice variant. No memory stolen. Just the feeling behind the words. It closed its eyes. And felt warm. So that's what he lost, it said aloud. Now it's mine. That night, Kael sat alone again. He spoke to the fire. Are you listening? The fragment pulsed in his palm. Then you need a name. I won't keep calling you power. That's not what you are. It shimmered just once. Not with light. With recognition. Kael whispered. Vorrin. The flame curled, twisting like breath. Senna stepped beside him, silent. That's not just a name, is it? She asked. Kael stared into the fire. No. That's the part of me that remembers what I gave up,